In this video, we're going to learn about the respiratory system. In the previous video, we learned about the digestive system, because in grade 10 we're learning about three main systems of the human body: the digestive, the circulatory, and the respiratory. So here we are in the respiratory system. These are our main learning goals for the lesson. As usual, follow along with the slide deck and the video to fill in the handout and to learn the important terms and concepts for the lesson. As we mentioned, we are focusing on the three main systems, in biology in grade 10. Our main focus for this lesson is the respiratory system. It's always important to watch the preview videos before you do a lesson. This video here is from the Amoeba Sisters, and this is a way to save someone from choking. And you can see the connection between respiratory and choking if you watch this video first and watch this one after. A very good practical example of why knowledge of biology is very useful. So when we examine the respiratory system, we'll start with its function. The main function, meaning the main job of the respiratory system, is to bring oxygen into the bloodstream and also to get rid of carbon dioxide. So here you can see a part of the respiratory system. We'll see what it's called later on, but you can see that oxygen is coming in, going into the blood, and carbon dioxide is going out of the blood, and eventually you breathe that out. So you breathe oxygen in to give it to the blood to deliver all over the body, and you get rid of the CO2 by breathing it out. In the respiratory system, there's two main actions that you do. You do inhalation, which means breathing in air, and that's mostly to collect the oxygen. And you do exhalation, which means to breathe out the air. Think exit, in, think in. And that you breathe out the air, and that will help you to get rid of the carbon dioxide, which is waste from your cells. Remember, cells do cellular respiration, and in cellular respiration, you take oxygen and sugar. You break down the sugar with the oxygen. That releases energy for you to use, but it also releases CO2, which is a waste product that you have to get rid of. It can't build up or it's dangerous for your body. Another thing that you'll sometimes see happen is what's called gas exchange. So in different tissues in the body, you'll see that we're trading oxygen and CO2. So oxygen goes into the tissues, into the blood, and CO2 comes out, so you can get rid of it. And that's called gas exchange, where you're trading one gas for another. And in these images here, you can see inhalation and exhalation occurring. So you can see this person here is breathing out, and this person here is breathing in. And in grade 11, you learn a bit more about the actions of the muscles to allow you to breathe out and breathe in. So we're going to analyze the pathway of air from the outside all the way to the inside of the lung, where the oxygen goes into the bloodstream. So the flow of air, primarily following oxygen, is entering the mouth or nasal cavity, the nose, then going to the pharynx, then to the larynx, then to the trachea, then to the lung itself. So you actually enter the lung at this point through what's called the bronchi. And then afterwards, those tubes become smaller and smaller tubes on both sides. And then eventually you get to these small tips called alveoli, and there you have some oxygen being traded for CO2 at the level of the blood. And so we'll analyze what's happening at each step along the way. But again, the main goal is to bring in oxygen to the lungs so that oxygen can go to the blood and be delivered throughout the body. So our first step along the journey is you breathe in the air. That contains a mixture of gases, but we're focusing on oxygen right now. Air can go in through the mouth or through the nose. The nose is sometimes called the nasal cavity, like a cave. And in the nasal cavity, it's actually good to breathe in through the nose because there's blood vessels that will warm the air and also filter the air. So the air is filtered before it continues going down the air pathways, the respiratory pathways. And like I said, air could also enter through the mouth. So the mouth and the nose is where air can enter. Then the air continues and goes to the back of the throat called the pharynx. So this portion here is called the pharynx, and there's actually several parts of the pharynx. There's the pharynx that's closest to the nose, it's called the nasopharynx. The pharynx closest to the mouth, that's called the oropharynx. And the pharynx more at the throat level, that's called the laryngopharynx. You don't have to know those divisions, just know that we have the pharynx over here. Now, once the air goes through the pharynx, it's going to go to the next part, which is the larynx. So this is the larynx here. The larynx is a portion that contains the vocal cords. So your vocal cords are actually contained in the larynx over here. And what you'll notice is the larynx, if you just kind of take the piece off and put it here, has a little piece over here that sticks out a bit. This is actually the Adam's apple. And in men is quite pronounced. It's a bit bigger in men. So if we go here, you'll see this portion here of the larynx is the Adam's apple. And because of the hormones, men have a larger Adam's apple, or a larger larynx portion here called the laryngeal prominence. But again, the main point is that the air is going into the larynx, which contains the vocal cords. And as air goes through, it creates sound, which allows you to speak. So now, we're going to continue our journey, and we're going to head down the next part, which is the trachea. So the trachea, we sometimes call that the windpipe. And it's basically where air continues to flow down on its journey towards entering the lungs. It's called the windpipe. And what I want you to understand is that that windpipe does not allow food to go into it. So this is the trachea. Do not think that it's part of the esophagus. The esophagus is actually behind the trachea. So if you look here, this is the airways. Here we have the trachea. And then right behind it, you have the esophagus where food would go down. So there's two separate pipes. The esophagus is for the food. The trachea is for the air. Now the trachea is made up of cartilage. So that's connective tissue. Okay. So it's supported by a ring of cartilage. And one important question we're going to try to answer is how does a food know to go down the esophagus and not down the trachea? This is just a picture over here showing you the larynx and trachea here removed from the body, and behind it you'd have the esophagus. So if we take a look over here, this is our trachea and this is the esophagus. There's a flap of tissue over the larynx called the epiglottis. When you swallow food, that flap of tissue actually closes. And so it closes off the trachea so that food can go down the esophagus and not down the trachea. Because if it goes down the trachea, then it gets into your lungs, your airways, and you could choke. So you want the food to go down the esophagus to your stomach, not down the trachea to your lungs. And it's all because of that little flap of tissue called the epiglottis found on the larynx to close off the trachea. So we continue our journey. And as we continue our journey, we finally get to the lungs. The trachea will bifurcate. Bifurcate is a fancy word for saying it'll split into two. There's a left side and there's a right side. So this is the patient's right side because you look at it from their perspective. So this is their right lung and this is their left lung. So as you can see here, the air is going to continue to the right and to the left. And when it splits, the two tubes that it splits into are called bronchi. So we have a right bronchus, and a left bronchus. Bronchus is singular. So right bronchus, left bronchus, or two bronchi. And what's important to understand is that these bronchi will eventually split into smaller and smaller tubes that the air will continue to go through. So here's a little thinking task before we continue on. This is the larynx, this is the trachea, and these are the bronchi, the right and the left. And so the task is, if you swallowed a marble and it went down your respiratory tract, which side would it most likely go down to? The right side or the left side? And then you have to explain why. So I'll give you a minute to try to think about it and pick a side. Look at the anatomical differences between the right and the left. You have a marble, which is a little ball that you swallow. Where would it, if it ends up here, does it roll down this way or roll down that way? So, the correct answer is it usually ends up more on the right side. So you can see that this tube here, this bronchus here, is a little bit wider than this one. So because it's a bit wider, the marble or item would just kind of go through here naturally. And it's more steep. So it's more likely to roll down this side compared to this side here. And most times when people swallow things and it goes down the wrong tube and ends up in the lungs, it usually ends up on the right side as opposed to the left side. Not saying it can't end up here, but most times it ends up on the right side. So the bronchi will split into smaller and smaller tubes called bronchioles. So as you can see, we split into smaller and smaller and smaller tubes called bronchioles, and the air continues their path down those bronchioles. Eventually, the bronchioles keep splitting and splitting and splitting until you get to the very end, and at the very end, the tips are called alveoli. And so here we are at the very end. This is a cluster of alveoli. We're going to zoom into those and see what happens at that portion. So here we are in the alveoli. We're zooming in. So this is the alveoli here. Okay, one is an alveolus, several alveoli. And what you'll notice is the alveoli are surrounded by blood vessels. Just like in the digestive system, where there is a blood vessels in the villi, we have blood vessels surrounding the alveoli. And the blood vessels are actually capillaries as well. They're the very small blood vessels that are very thin to allow for movement, for diffusion, for movement of things across them. And so in the alveoli, the oxygen that reaches them will go into the blood on specific cells called red blood cells. They're specialized cells that contain hemoglobin to carry oxygen throughout the body. And the CO2 that the blood collected from all the tissues in the cells, the waste that the blood collected, is going to go into the alveoli and basically the other direction. We're going to go backwards to breathe that out. So O2 comes in to the cells, to the red blood cells, into the capillaries, delivered throughout the body. CO2 that was collected as garbage goes into the alveoli, and then we breathe that out. And so this is some gas exchange happening here. So again, you can see capillaries, a common connection between the circulatory system and respiratory system, but also a common connection between the circulatory system and the digestive system. And so you can see another picture of that here. When you zoom into the alveoli, you can see carbon dioxide going out of the blood and into the alveoli to breathe it out, and oxygen going into the blood, and then you can deliver that throughout the body. Now, one thing to mention here as well is you'll notice that the blood, before it gets oxygen, has a blue color to it, and as it gets oxygen, it becomes more red. In reality, the blood is always red. The textbooks just show blue and red to highlight the difference between blood that contains oxygen, so red, and blood that does not contain oxygen, or as much, so blue. So blue would be deoxygenated blood, not as much oxygen, and red would be oxygenated blood, a lot of oxygen. But again, it's always red. It's just textbooks color-coded this way. So now, before we move on, we'll make another connection between the respiratory system and other systems in the body. There's a great connection between respiratory system and the muscular system. This is the diaphragm. It's the muscle of respiration. It basically contracts and relaxes to allow your rib cage to expand and to collapse, so that you can breathe in and out. So it helps with the acts of inhaling and exhaling. And so there's a connection between this muscle system here and then also the respiratory system. And keep in mind, to move this, there must be some kind of nerve signal. So there's a connection with the nervous system as well, right? And you're not thinking about it, so there's probably an involuntary connection there, an involuntary movement, but it's still a connection between the nervous system as well. So we have nervous system, muscle system, and respiratory system all working together to accomplish the function of allowing you to breathe. So our musculoskeletal system interacting. We're going to talk a little bit more about some specialized cells within the system. The trachea and bronchi, so the trachea over here and the bronchi, they are coated in these special cells called ciliated epithelial cells. And those ciliated epithelial cells, here's a picture of them under a microscope, and here's a little animation of them. They have these little hairs on them that are called cilia. And these little hairs basically can sweep things out of the system. So if there's something bad that comes in here, it'll sweep it out so you can just cough it up. But also the specialized cells help to make mucus. So the mucus will help to trap bacteria and dirt and dangerous things we don't want getting in, so that we can sweep it out using the cilia. So these are specialized cells within the respiratory system. Here we have a diagram of the respiratory system just to summarize the pathway we saw. So we saw that air enters the nose and the mouth, go into the pharynx, then go into the larynx, and go down to the trachea, then to the left and right bronchus, then into the bronchioles, then you go all the way down to the alveoli eventually. Just a little reminder about this being the right side here and this being the left side, and that's because this is from the patient's perspective, so right and left. And then this is our muscle of respiration over here, the diaphragm. And of course, we can never have a lesson without a lame joke. How do you make a tissue dance? You put a little boogie in it. You'll never forget that one. So these are some videos going over some disorders of the respiratory system. So please do watch these. This one here is about asthma. It's a great little tidbit of information to understand what asthma is, because there's a lot of people affected by it. And you can also hear a little bit about how climate change impacts people who have asthma as well. So knowing these common disorders is actually very important in society. And to finish off, we're going to make a little bit of a connection between cellular respiration and the systems we've seen so far. We'll see this in more detail later on. But remember, cellular respiration is the whole idea that your cells need energy to survive, so they get sugar and other fuels. And there's energy trapped in the sugar, so you use oxygen to break the sugar open, and that releases the energy, which we call ATP. But when you break the sugar open, the packaging is left behind, and that's carbon dioxide and water. So this is the chemical equation written with the skeleton equation written with symbols instead. You can see we have glucose, which is sugar, reacting with oxygen to make CO2 and water, and an energy, which we use to do work. And the respiratory system, what it helps to do is it helps with this part here, bringing in the oxygen into the blood. So we need that piece. And then the oxygen can be delivered to the cells and delivered to the mitochondrion to do cellular respiration. But it also helps with this part, getting rid of the CO2. So the waste that's made is CO2, and it's not good to have that waste build up in the body, right? So then the CO2 will be released into the blood, so you can actually deliver it all over. You can actually deliver it to the lungs so you can breathe it out. So there's a reverse process of the oxygen. And then, of course, in the digestive system, we know it's the sugar that's the sugar is brought in by the digestive system, because your food contains sugars. You break it down, you absorb it into the small intestine via the capillaries and the villi, and that's delivered to the cells where it meets the oxygen to do cellular respiration. And then in the next lesson that we see on circulatory system, we'll basically see that the other connection to cellular respiration is that the circulatory system delivers all these ingredients and products all the way around the body, so we can get rid of them or take them in the right spot. This here is our consolidation tasks. So there's always a recap video that you can watch. You should complete any learning goals and worksheets that you have, especially the labels to practice. To summarize in your lab notebook, if you have the 2-page summary task, or depending on what your teacher has told you, these are some good ways to start thinking about how to summarize the concept of the respiratory system.